Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you. My colleague and boss, Sabine Vaillant, was supposed to be with us today. She asked me to stand in for her because she has to travel with the president today rather unexpectedly. But it's very good that we have a chance to interact from the European Commission side, from the trade side, with you, with the community that is represented here. I think it's very good that we are able to benefit from analysis, scenario construction, scenario building. I think we need more scenarios going forward as we look into the future. Probably we live in a world where making forecasts are going to be more and more complicated because there are so many trend breaks that forecasting is becoming a very heroic profession, probably. So scenarios are definitely going to become a useful tool for trying to navigate in policy making the different challenges and shocks that we are confronted with. We are undertaking the EU trade policy for the European Union area of shocks, of geoeconomic and geopolitical challenges. And I will say a few words about this, perhaps to set out some thoughts and some ideas for your conference today. Let me start by this question of how we see going forward in Brussels this articulation and this new interface between trade and geopolitics before moving to the policies around resilience and the adaptation of the EU trade policy going forward. On this question of trade, investment, international economic relations and geopolitics, I think we see a much greater interaction. We see a sort of, sometimes I say, a hard re-entry of hard geopolitics into the otherwise previously quiet atmosphere of international economic relations. That's what we're essentially we are dealing with. This comes from various actions, from various trade partners. Let me recall the sort of phenomena that we have seen emerging over the last few years. Over the past years, we have seen, out of jurisdictions like China, various economic coercive measures affecting European interests and other countries around the world. During the years of the Trump administration, the US also introduced or threatened to introduce measures that put pressure on other economies, including the EU. And with the current administration, we have been able at least to put in abeyance some of these irritants and tensions. In the initial period of the pandemic, temporary restrictions further increased a number of supply chain disruptions, which were then reversed. And overall, global value chains have held up under shock, but they have been put to the shock and to a form of stress test. Russia has also repeatedly weaponized its role as an energy supplier and Europe's dependence on its natural gas. And actually, in the face of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, together with a sanctioning coalition, we have ourselves imposed unprecedented economic sanctions on the Russian economy. So we have also weaponized Russia's dependencies on the West. And more recently, in the context of the US-China technological competition, which is itself a reflection of a form of great power rivalry, both the US and China have introduced export control measures for certain technologies or components and inputs in advanced semiconductors, while on the other hand, China is imposing or has introduced a number of restrictive measures for critical raw materials, on gallium, germanium, graphite, and we are very closely monitoring the emergence of these new forms of trade restrictive measures. And at the same time as all this is happening, the global architecture, so the international system of economic governance, is being chipped away at, is more fragile, is under challenge. And it's not a crisis of multilateralism which is the cause, it's the fact that some of these bigger geopolitical tensions are reverberating inside the system of international economic governance and weakening it. Some ask, actually, we have reached a point where you have, in some quarters, people asking whether we need institutions of global economic governance as they have been operating until now, whether the time has passed. On the European side, the view is very clear. We need them. We need a rules-based system more than ever. At a time of tensions and when there are risks of fragmentation, we need to double down on safeguarding the forum, the institutions, for cooperation, and that underpin a system of rules. It's difficult because it's very difficult to produce multilateral rules these days going forward because of lack of shared objectives, lack of a sense of a commonality in terms of interest, and great power confrontation. But the alternative is worse. There are some indications that the system is holding up. The World Trade Organization, which indeed has not produced more global rules, or very few more global rules in the last few years, has nevertheless shown some degree of resilience. In June 2022, there were agreements reached at the previous ministerial conference. We have ourselves tried to shore up the rules-based system of the WTO in its dispute settlement function by basically trying to propose to cooperating members a stopgap for the elements of the dispute settlement arm of the WTO which are not functioning right now, namely the appellate body. So that's the context, and that brings me to the question of the shift in paradigm, the resilience, efficiency question, and the trade-off between those. The international economic system for a long time was driven essentially by a logic of efficiency, which has been at the heart of the exponential growth that we have seen and the emergence of new economic powers, the lifting of a vast number of people globally out of poverty. Today, we're seeing a sort of partial shift in the paradigm, where it is in part efficiency, but there is a dose of resilience and security that is being introduced, one way or the other, in that paradigm. It doesn't mean abandoning the logic of efficiency and more global economic integration, because that would be extremely costly for the global economy and wrong, but a certain course correction with an introduction of a dosage of resilience, security in the mix and in the logic. We have seen in recent years that there are some risks that come with interdependencies, especially when the dependencies are asymmetric and can be weaponized. We have seen that in the access to masks and vaccines, energy, raw materials needed for a competitive and green economy, and therefore in Europe, in many other trading partners of the European Union, what we're seeing is that there is a trend towards making supply chains more diversified and more resilient, diversifying sources of supply, being able to tap into alternatives. And so this shift reflects the fact that we have entered a form of transition, one where we need to face up to the risk of conflict, great power competition, and where power-based relations are becoming more prevalent. It'll be important not to get this wrong, not to misjudge this shift in paradigm and start looking at economic relations as a zero-sum game, which it is not. And to start seeing independencies solely as risk and not as an opportunity. So therefore there is a question of balance, there is a question of trade-off. And this is why, by the way, in this reevaluation of policies, the economic profession plays a key role, because the economic profession, as opposed perhaps to people who operate in the security realm, think in terms of trade-offs, understand that there are trade-offs. And it is very important for policymakers to get the trade-offs right, and therefore to be able to measure them, to assess them with support from those that are looking at the world in this way. Now, what do we do in the face of this? Let me turn perhaps to the question of policy. We are continuing to maintain an active trade policy setting, and we are probably one of the most active players in policies that seek, through trade, investment, treaties, negotiations, to go towards yet more global economic integrations. We are the #1 trading partner for 54 countries around the world, who represent 48% of global GDP. So we have a strong global footprint through trade and investment integration. We're also a global leader in investment. You were talking about the issues around investment and investment dependencies. We're the world's largest investor abroad. We have 33% of the total share of foreign direct investment globally, and we remain attractive to foreign investment as a destination. We are hosting foreign investments of more than 11 trillion euros, so that's 25% of the stock of global FDI. And there is a strong consensus still in the EU about the benefits of trade and the benefits of having these mechanisms of integration in the global economy, creating opportunities for businesses through market access and economies of scale, getting access to the inputs that we need as a resource-poor continent, especially for the green and digital transition. So we are not turning mercantilist. It's an import and export story. And we will never lose sight, of course, of that reality from the government or the policy standpoint. Our integration through trade networks is making us more resilient through diversification. And it is enabling us to support also more globally what we believe is important in terms of security ultimately, which is the pursuit of a number of sustainability objectives through trade and investment linkages. Evidently, all this is also linked to competitiveness, innovation, productivity. There is evidence that for the European economies, if we have a 1% increase in the openness of the European economy, we do have a substantial, it leads to a substantial increase in productivity further down the line, and we should not lose sight of this. We are not. This is very much part and parcel of the Green Deal Industrial Plan and some of the policy settings that this Commission has put forward. Now, if we look then further, building on this to the future, just a few words and a few thoughts about how we see the next few months, the next few years in terms of trade policy setting. So first, we need to continue supporting the baseline, a solid, rules-based system, which is not just a condition for efficiency and global economic integration, also an element of our economic security. We see very much the rules-based system as part and parcel of any economic security strategy. There will not be economic security in a purely power-based international economic relations world. This is why we are going to continue to lead efforts to reform the WTO. We are not giving up on the WTO. It needs to be reformed, probably root and branch, in order to regain speed and centrality. And this is exactly what we are going to be continuing to work on together with partners. We have, in addition, of course, built and continuing to build a vast network of bilateral trade agreements. It does form part of the rules-based system because our preferential agreements, the free trade agreements that we have in place, that web of agreements is also providing us with stability and predictability. It is giving us a tool for economic influence, and it is increasing our ability to shape the global rules of trade and investment. So that's the first element. The second element is finding the balance between the different trade-offs that are evidently at play right now, and notably the trade-offs between efficiency and resilience. And here, the Commission has tried to set out this new plank of policy through an economic security strategy that was adopted and proposed to the Member States and the European Parliament in June of this year, and it is currently being implemented inside the European Commission very actively. There's an enormous amount of effort and work on the economics security strategy and its different component parts. It's a strategy that is designed to put under one conceptual roof, if you want, all of the relevant internal and external measures that we have in place or that we need to develop in order to respond to a number of risks. And this is why it starts with a proper, serious assessment of a number of risks to our supply chains, risks to our critical technologies, risks to infrastructure, and the risks that we face of weaponization of some of the dependencies that we have in place. And getting the risk assessment right between the European Commission and the Member States at a certain level of granularity is what the work is about right now. It is, as you can imagine, very complex, because if you want to do a serious risk assessment of critical technologies, it requires an enormous amount of input, expertise, and it's an exercise that does require at the EU level, because we are not a unitary state, the central level, if you want, the European Commission to work in a very integrated manner with member states, their assets and their capacities. Any economic security strategy needs to be targeted and needs to be proportionate in the way it's going to deploy instruments of risk mitigation once those risk assessments have been put in place. And this is why the strategy has a sort of three-pronged or three-pillar approach, as you probably know, of promote, protect, and partner. So it's about protecting our interests, but it's also about promoting the EU's economic competitiveness through a number of initiatives. And it's about partnering, which is not an afterthought. We are not doing economic strategy in a bubble. We understand that this is economic strategy in a highly connected international economy where we need to partner with a vast number of countries around the world to make this both meaningful in terms of the management and mitigation of risks, and to make sure that the strategy does not become self-defeating because it would close us somehow from those partners and partnerships. That overall exercise of de-risking, because this is what this is about at its core, is indeed something which is not a pure policy exercise. And this is the point that you were referring to. I think it's a very important point that I would also like to stress. The de-risking of the various aspects and components of the European economy is going to take place through market forces, very largely because we are a market economy, in a large part, and in part through policies. And the question of balance between how much de-risking takes place through market forces and how much de-risking takes place through policy inducement is a very important question. There, the private sector, economic operators, have agency on this question. Looking at Luisa from Business Europe, who is there to exercise that corporate agency on economic security. We need to set up structures as we develop an economic security strategy, which is going to get government, in our case, the executive arm of the EU, the Commission, but also national governments, to interface in an intelligent way with our market forces, because the de-risking will come primarily from there. Third element, a more nimble, a more flexible trade policy setting going forward. We will continue to negotiate comprehensive free trade agreements. We believe they have value. We believe they connect us to the rest of the global economy. We have recently successfully concluded such agreements with New Zealand, with Chile, with Kenya. That further expands this stock of free trade agreements, preferential agreements that we have in place. We have 42 FTAs in place, which are being implemented on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to continue to engage with several other important partners through FTA negotiations. India, Indonesia. We're relaunching negotiations with a country like Thailand. and exploring other possibilities with other partners in the Indo-Pacific, because obviously there having a network of FTAs is very important given the regional integration processes that we see in that part of the world. I'm thinking about Malaysia, I'm thinking about the Philippines. And we also are taking talks further, as you know, with other partners, Mercosur, Mexico, and when we resume discussions, Australia. On the other hand, beyond the FTAs, and this is where we need to have probably more creativity going forward. And there again, we need to speak to stakeholders because, in my experience, creativity is not necessarily the material in the highest supply inside governments. There's a limit to creativity inside bureaucracies, let's put it this way. So we need creativity in the way we design new alternative forms of engagement, of economic engagement with partners. We have been developing certain forms of engagement which are different from the classical FTAs. Trade and technology councils with the US and India, sustainable investment facilitation agreements, the first one of which was negotiated with a country like Angola. Digital trade agreements that we are putting in train with Singapore and South Korea, where we have launched negotiations this year. Agreements on cross-border data flows, for example, with Japan, a very important jurisdiction. So we will probably need to have more adaptative, differentiated forms of international economic engagement going forward in the next few years. And finally, more coherence between internal and external actions. That is also very much the order of the day inside the European Commission. Trade policy is part and parcel of the broader external action, so we need to have more integration between the traditional common commercial policy instruments and what we do through other policies. That's why we have been engaging across the Commission and different services and Directorate General, international partnerships, the DGs that are responsible for our relations with the neighborhood, the External Action Service. We also need to continue to cooperate with the parts of the European Commission which design internal EU policies for the single market, but which have major implications for our external economic relations. So invest notably in cooperation with our partners regarding the implementation of various Green Deal initiatives. We have to be very clear on this. There is a limit to the Brussels effect. We cannot export wholesale our regulatory policies to the rest of the world. There are issues of compatibility, of equivalency. Our partners have the legitimate concerns about their own regulatory sovereignty. So whilst we have a strong asset in the single market and the attractiveness of the single market, we also have to be able, going forward, to do more and better in terms of international regulatory cooperation to foster regulatory convergence, i.e. behind the border integration, but through cooperation, not by thinking that we can export wholesale our regulatory models, leading a number of countries to in a sense, consider that we are exercising some form of green colonialism. We need to be mindful of those criticisms. We are mindful of those criticisms, and we need to adjust our policies going forward on this. The same goes with the integration between trade and investment and development cooperation. Here, the Global Gateway is a case in point. It's in the early days of implementation, but as you know, there are now a significant number of Global Gateway flagship projects. And we need to see how we then complement these kinds of initiatives, Global Gateway, with other types of economic frameworks that we're putting in place. I'm thinking, for example, about the sustainable investment facilitation agreements. So there is, as you can see, a pretty large menu of actions, of strands and policies that are constantly being reviewed in a very fast-changing environment. This will be the subject of further reflections as we head into the next Commission next year, where further adaptations of that policy stance, that external economic stance, are inevitably going to be necessary, given the fact that we are in a world of geoeconomic confrontation, heading towards more challenges rather than less in this area and for our common commercial policy. So I will leave it there. I hope that's helpful in terms of overall scene setting, echoes some of the points that you have identified in your work, and hopefully allows for good discussions in the conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these very insightful and interesting remarks. It's very interesting to see that these, to what extent these things are all in flux, and also to see the adjustment really going on. So thanks also for jumping in the short term, and our greetings to Mrs. Weyand. I mean, the fact that she had to travel short time maybe also reflects this geopolitical volatility we have at the moment. So we now have a short break, and we then have our first panel, and I'll see you there at 11:30 sharp. Thank you.